On the 4th of July, red, white, and blue bunting adorned the south portico of the White House.
The U.S. Marine Corps band was playing patriotic tunes as military families gathered for a picnic.
And President Donald Trump signed his big budget bill with a thick black Sharpie.
And our country's had so much to celebrate this Independence Day. As we enter our 249th year, America is winning like never before.
Congress narrowly approved the sweeping tax and spending bill, with most Republicans voting in favor and every Democrat opposed.
On the floor, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries quoted the late Georgia Congressman John Lewis and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Dr. King said that if you can't fly, run.
That's right.
If you can't run, walk. If you can't walk, crawl. But at all times, press on.
The law includes $4.5 trillion in tax cuts, praised by Republicans like Congressman Mike Collins.
It wasn't easy, but you know what they always say, anything worthwhile seldom is easy. The golden age of America, it is back.
Democrats like Senator John Ossoff slammed deep cuts to food assistance and Medicaid.
This bill is a disaster for the state of Georgia. It guts the Medicaid program and puts nursing homes and hospitals at risk.
On today's show, we take a closer look at how President Trump's big, beautiful bill will affect Georgia now that it's law. I'm WABE politics reporter Rahul Bali.
I'm WABE politics reporter Sam Gringlas, and this is Plugged In from WABE. All right, we're going to break down some of the big features of President Trump's sweeping tax and spending law. And we're going to begin by looking at what the law will mean for health coverage.
And to do that, we're lucky to have WABE health reporter Jess Mador as our guide. Jess, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So Jess, let's start with the big picture here. How many Georgians are expected to lose health coverage broadly under this law?
Well, according to the Congressional Budget Office, almost 12 million people nationwide are expected to lose their health insurance. In Georgia, it's going to be at least 300,000 people. That's according to KFF, which is citing the CBO analysis from back in June. But the final version of the bill made even deeper cuts, so that number's likely to be higher. Overall, this bill cuts more than $1 trillion in health spending over the next decade.
So let's break down those numbers a little more. You know, some of the coverage loss comes from policy changes to Medicaid. Remind us who's covered by Medicaid and tell us about the scope of these cuts.
Nationwide, Medicaid health insurance covers more than 70 million people. So these are low-income adults and children, people who are elderly, sick, or people with disabilities. In Georgia, roughly 2 million people are covered under Medicaid health insurance. And, you know, the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, which is an advocacy group, has estimated that Georgia stands to lose $10 billion with a B in federal Medicaid dollars over the next decade. So, you know, the state's going to face some difficult choices. You know, the state's going to have to either find ways to raise additional revenue to help fill these critical funding gaps or, you know, make other choices, changes to Medicaid, potentially what the program covers and who qualifies and what, you know, benefits they can receive if they can get into Medicaid.
So a lot of the changes to Medicaid have to do with enacting work reporting requirements as a condition for receiving benefits. Jess, what's the idea here?
Republicans who support this bill say it will root out waste, fraud, and abuse. You know, the idea is to get as many people who can work working. The problem is that more than 2/3 of adults on Medicaid already work, and the rest are either in school or they're too sick or disabled to work. So policy experts say national work requirements won't boost employment. And also, you know, the reporting requirements are cumbersome. They say, you know, complicated, difficult. It's red tape. It's paperwork. It's been likened to, you know, filing your tax returns a couple times a year. It just to keep your health insurance that you already qualify for. And in order to report your work hours, you need reliable internet or transportation. And many people with the low incomes that qualify them for Medicaid may not have access to those things all the time. And, Medicaid pays providers, it pays doctors, hospitals. It doesn't pay patients. It's not a cash program. So there is a question about how much, waste, fraud, and abuse could be eliminated with a program like this.
Jess, Georgia is the only state with an active Medicaid work requirement already, and that program's been pretty troubled, right?
Yeah, Georgia is the only state with a Medicaid work requirement in place right now. Other states have proposed similar programs, but Georgia has the only program that's running. It's been up and running for 2 years. Actually, July is the 2-year anniversary. Georgia's program is called Pathways to Coverage, and the state says it spent more than $91 million on the program. More than $50 million of that has gone toward the enrollment system itself. And right now, just under 7,500 people are enrolled.
In Georgia, an even bigger bucket of people may lose coverage who purchase their insurance through the exchange created through the Affordable Care Act. Jess, how many people are we talking about, and what will cause people to lose coverage?
Well, the big budget bill makes changes to the ACA. So you may remember for the last few years hearing about enhanced tax credits. These are subsidies that make people's monthly premiums for their health insurance through the marketplace more affordable. In some cases, much more affordable. So, as a result, we've seen record numbers of people across the country getting health insurance through the marketplace, including in Georgia. And under the new budget bill, these enhanced premium tax credits are going to expire at the end of this year. And so just that change alone means many, many, many people's premiums are going to go up. And in some cases, by hundreds of dollars a year. And Georgia already has one of the highest rates of uninsured people in the nation. So these changes, the expiration of these subsidies are likely to make it even harder for people to get covered and stay covered. KFF has estimated that this change could result in at least 250,000 more Georgians becoming uninsured.
And how will all this affect hospitals, especially rural hospitals that, Jess, as you've reported, have already been struggling in recent years?
Medicaid is a program that's funded jointly by the federal government and states. So one thing the new law does is it limits states' ability to finance their share of Medicaid. It freezes existing provider taxes and prohibits them from creating new provider taxes. So this really will limit the state's ability to draw down additional Medicaid funds that do go to help sustain, safety net hospitals and rural hospitals. And one report from the Shep Center at the University of North Carolina has found that at least 4 in Georgia are at immediate risk of closing as a result of this law. Nationwide, more than 300 rural hospitals are at risk. And so this is worrying a lot of people in healthcare because fewer people with health insurance means more uncompensated care for clinics and hospitals. And this is expected to have ripple effects for many, many years.
So is the state already trying to take action or planned action around this law? And what have they done?
The Georgia Department of Community Health convened an emergency meeting to talk about how they can increase the state fees that support hospitals around the state. And this would be to help make up for this anticipated loss in federal funding. And I'm also hearing that other state officials are talking about other ways that the state might be able to help mitigate some of these impacts.
Jess, in the days following the passage and the signing of this massive new law, My email box was flooded with statements and so much out on social media, but there was one that really got my attention, and that was the president and CEO of the Georgia Hospital Association, Kaylee Nagel. I just want to share a couple of sentences that kind of jumped out to me. Quote, "While we are disheartened by the healthcare provisions that will impact our hospitals and then patients that they serve, we're grateful that our Georgia delegation members on both sides of the aisle worked with us to preserve a number of our existing programs," unquote. And then one of the finishing lines, quote, "The real implications of this bill are unavoidable and undeniable." So those couple of sentences jumped out at me. Jess?
It is interesting, and there are a lot of these conversations going on right now, and it's worth noting, too, that meanwhile, the push to fully expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, which would cover people up to 138% of poverty in Georgia, is ongoing. Advocates say this is more urgent than ever, considering we could see hundreds of thousands more Georgians losing their health insurance under this bill.
That's WABE health reporter Jess Mador. Jess, thanks so much for sharing your reporting.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let's take a break. You're listening to Plugged In from WABE. Welcome back to Plugged In from WABE.
We're talking about how President Trump's massive tax and spending law may affect Georgia. We just heard about how many Georgians may lose health coverage. On a previous show, we discussed how slashing clean energy tax credits could impact Georgia solar and electric vehicle manufacturing. That includes tax credits for consumers to buy electric vehicles and solar panels, an up to $7,500 tax credit for buying a new EV that was supposed to last until 2032 is now going away after September 30th, and a tax credit covering up to 30% of the cost of buying and installing solar panels will now be eliminated after this year. Montana Bush is president of Athens-based installer Alternative Energy Southeast. He's putting plans on hold to hire 10 employees at a new Savannah office.
Let's just say it doesn't look good. Maybe we can survive, but majority of solar companies, they would go under.
Now let's talk about the biggest ticket item in this tax and spending package, and that's the $4.5 trillion worth of tax cuts. Rahul, what's in that?
Yeah, the biggest thing there, Sam, the extension of the 2017 tax cuts.
Now, I just want to note a lot of analysis has been done over who benefited most from those 2017 tax cuts. And according to the Bipartisan Policy Center, high-income taxpayers did receive a larger share of overall tax cut dollars compared to middle or low-income taxpayers. But the tax cuts did not exclusively benefit the wealthy. Middle and lower-income taxpayers benefited as well.
So some of the new things that comes with this package includes a temporary elimination of the tax on tips and overtime. That's something you heard on the campaign trail. This law also increases the child tax credit by $200, and it increases the tax deduction for some tax filers 65 and older. The law includes hiking spending on defense and border security, and the CBO estimates that the law will add about $3.5 trillion to the deficit over the next decade.
So we've been talking about how lawmakers want to offset some of those tax cuts by slashing Medicaid funding. Another way is by cutting food assistance. Here's Democratic Congresswoman Nikema Williams.
When SNAP is slashed, food banks feel the pain in real time. Higher demand, increased strain on volunteers and donated supplies. This would make a bad situation worse for food banks across the country, including the Atlanta Community Food Bank in my district, which is already struggling.
To talk about what food assistance cuts could mean for Georgia, we're joined by WABE digital editor MeiMei Xu, who's been following this topic. MeiMei, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
So let's just start off with what Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program is.
Yeah, many people know this program as SNAP, or more traditionally, it's also been known as food stamps. It is the nation's largest food assistance program, and it can help low-income families afford essential groceries.
So how many people in Georgia get help with their groceries from SNAP?
Yeah, it's around 1.4 million Georgians and 680,000 Georgian households. Georgia receives around $3 billion in federal money for SNAP. And every month, Georgians receive around $190 per individual and $400 per household.
So explain the changes that are being made to how this program is being funded.
Right now, SNAP benefits are 100% federally funded, but states help administer the program. Under the new law, though, states would have to shoulder some of the burden of paying for the benefits of SNAP. This is based on something called the payment error rate, which measures how much a state overpays or underpays beneficiaries of SNAP when it administers the program. So this can happen in a number of ways, including if a beneficiary forgets to update their income or if the state doesn't calculate, household expenses correctly. And states also do reimburse or recoup the money if they identify an error. The amount of money a state is on the hook for when it comes to paying for SNAP depends on how big the percentage of this payment error rate is. If we go off the most recent data for Georgia, the state's most recent payment error rate is more than 15%. And so 15% of around $3 billion is around $450 million.
When would all of this take effect? It's not immediately, right?
No, it's not. This would take effect starting fiscal year 2028. So that would be October 2027.
And so just to kind of put a finer point on what you're saying, fewer people able to get groceries through SNAP, they're going to then need to head on over to their local food bank to kind of make up that difference.
Exactly. And this is what Atlanta Community Food Bank President and CEO Kyle Wade told me. He said this means longer lines at their food distribution partners at a time when they've already been experiencing a 60% increase in demand from 3 years ago and cuts that have already happened to a USDA program. And these cuts have amounted to $15 million worth of food. Here's what he had to say.
So that you can see that's kind of a perfect storm of reducing our resources at the very time that we're going to see increased levels of need.
Of course, the Atlanta Community Food Bank does take donations through philanthropy and private donors and things of that sort, but the USDA cuts do amount to quite a lot, and they're already having to deal with an increased demand. So this will definitely put a strain on the resources.
That's WABE digital editor MeiMei Xu. Thank you so much for your reporting, and thanks for coming on the show for the first time.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. It was great.
So, Rahul, we've just been talking about how cutting SNAP funding could result in the state having to share more of the costs in this program. And you've been looking at this question more broadly, how the law could affect Georgia's state budget overall.
Okay, so let's start with the basic numbers. For the 2026 state budget, which took effect July 1st, that number is $37.7 billion. But if you go a few lines down in the state budget, you'll see the words total federal funds, which for the 2026 state budget is an additional $22.5 billion. And that's where the concern is, Sam. What happens in Washington affecting the state budget? Sam, look, I actually did the Control F. Total federal funds, just those three words together, were mentioned 372 times in the state budget.
So can you give us some examples?
Okay, so there's $2 billion for K through 12 education, $70 million for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, $7 million for forestry, and $1 million for economic development. My point is, federal dollars play a key role all over the state budget.
All right, but in the context of this reconciliation bill, a lot of what we're talking about are cuts to Medicaid funding, and that's about $13 billion for the state of Georgia.
So yeah, Sam, and that was one of the things that we talked about at a Georgia Budget and Policy Institute event. It was actually held on the first day of the 2026 state budget, July 1st, but that, of course, happened to be the same time when all of this was happening around that massive tax and spending bill. The organization's Director of Health Justice, Leah Chan, gives the bottom line of what any changes to Medicaid policy or federal funding means for the program. That is a state and federal partnership that, the feds pay 66% of healthcare benefits and the state pays the rest.
So effectively, what these federal funding cuts to Medicaid do is really shift costs to the state. So it really forces the state to either pick up the tab or, make difficult decisions about who continues to receive these services and what benefits they're offered.
So what does that mean for the state budget? Are changes going to be needed? When would those happen? Does a special session need to be called to do that? Kind of what happens next year?
Special session, man, Sam, I know how much you love those two words, the special session.
Look, I don't think anyone, whether it's reporters or lawmakers, really want to be back at the Capitol during summer vacation working on amending the state budget.
Yeah, I don't think most people, as much as I love the state capitol, I'm not looking to be down there every day for a couple of weeks. Look, as I mentioned, the current state budget kicks in July 1st. Many of the federal changes won't kick in till later this year. Some don't kick in, as MeiMei mentioned, for a few years. Anything that has a major effect on this current state budget, that can be adjusted early next year in what is called the amended state budget. That's something that the governor and state lawmakers do every single year. And remember, the state does have billions of surplus dollars to work with, at least in the short term. Bottom line, you're probably not looking at a special session this year. Plus, the last time I was at the Capitol, Sam, I mean, the renovations, they are major. There's really not even a place to have a special session. Sam, let's move over to the politics of this law.
Well, we know that Governor Brian Kemp supports the law. His spokesperson, Garrison Douglas, wrote in a statement last week that, quote, raising taxes on millions of hardworking Georgians, especially as they continue to deal with the disastrous economic effects of the previous administration, is not an option. And we know Republicans in Washington are cheering it as well. Here's Representative Brian Jack.
This bill is a codification of President Trump's agenda, and in large part, many of us were elected on an identical platform when we ran for Congress.
But polling suggests the law overall is broadly unpopular, though depending on how specific provisions are framed in the public opinion research, that might change a little bit. We also know Democrats want to tie Republicans to the law ahead of the midterms, but some changes, as we've been talking about, don't take effect right away, so it may be tricky to make some of the program cuts tangible for voters.
A quick reminder before we get out of here that a statewide Democratic primary runoff for one of the 5 seats on the Georgia Public Service Commission is this Tuesday. It's important to remember the PSC has significant oversight over Georgia Power and other utilities. This is a race we've covered and will continue to cover until November. That's it for this edition of Plugged In from WABE.
Plugged In is produced by Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Helmick.
Plugged In is available wherever you want to listen. If you listen on demand, make sure you head over to the Plugged In feed, subscribe, and leave us a rating.
You can now also find us on the radio at 90.1 every Friday morning from 9:30 to 10.
And remember, as public media faces an uncertain funding stream, you can support this work with a gift at wabe.org/donate. I'm WABE politics reporter Rahul Bali.
I'm WABE politics reporter Sam Gringlas. We'll be back next week.